Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all. Thank you very much for coming. This is our 7th of 8 session. It seems like an age when we started this back on Monday morning. But we've found, certainly within the TNFD, we found these sessions really useful, from all the discussions that we've had with the panelists, but also from the breakout groups with the audience. I mean, that's been really important to get all the understanding and perspectives and priorities from the audience members. And the key point, I think, that we're looking to try and achieve here is relatively simplistic. We have data providers, albeit, all the way across the kind of the data landscape, and data users. And the point is around context, is the understanding around what the data users are looking to interact with and how they interpret data and what they need, and the data providers, what they can provide, how they provide it, and where the gaps and challenges are. So we end up, hopefully, no pressure panelists, but we end up having a pretty fluid discussion on that, and it's really interesting to kind of see what comes out. So I just encourage you to have that. I'm looking forward to have that being facilitated by Dan, who is my co-chair for the Data Catalyst. So that will be great. Just to say a quick word on the Data Catalyst, which I think many of you are either members of or are aware of. It consists of about 105, 106 entities now, representative of the nature-related data landscape, from the large data actors like MSCI, to the non-profit aggregators, conveners of data like IBAT and the like, through to nature tech entities, through to academia, through to governments, and some non-profits like global canopy, etc. So it's really good to have those different perspectives there, and hopefully we can really enable the adoption of the TNFD framework in the shortest time frame possible. Hello, by the broadest number of users. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dan to facilitate the discussion. Thank you very much. Ed, you look very lonely there, by the way.
So panelists, come and sit up at the front here and I'll introduce you. Yeah. Well, I think we have a lot of Australians on the line. Good. Well, thank you, James, for the introduction. My name is Dan O'Brien. I'm a partner with PWC in our, we've got everybody on this side here. Why don't we have a few others just to even things out?
Oh, it's chaos.
I'm with PWC, but I'm not actually an accountant. I'm a registered professional biologist. So it's interesting to see how the field of biology is starting to find its way into professional services. So, and I'm really excited. I get to represent PwC on the task force for nature-related financial disclosures. Work on the line here is one of my co-task force members as well. So you're lucky today. You get to hear from two of us who've been involved in the development of the framework. I'm also really excited over the past week just to see the level of interest and excitement around TNFD and the level of commitment from businesses and the business community around nature and biodiversity, and the commitment to disclosures and making this information available. As James said, one of the things that we've sort of identified is that for broad scale market adoption of TNFD across all sectors, there has to be useful, decision useful and available data sources for companies to assess their nature-related impacts, their dependencies, and then translate that into the risks and opportunities. This is critical. Otherwise, the framework will be released, and you'll have a lot of organizations out there saying, "Okay, well, what next? How do we do this? What's the approach?" And so, data, clear sector guidance, and instructions on how to apply it are really critical. So, as James said, the Data Catalyst Initiative and the work that we're doing with the Data and Analytics Working Group is really to help understand and identify the landscape of available data platforms and tools that are out there, and to bring that together with users and examples of organizations that have been using these data sets so that we can really make this these use cases clear And so people can see how these data tools are being used, but also to really start to flag and identify where there are challenges and are gaps. So perhaps it's particular biomes that aren't well represented, or it's certain sectors that aren't as mature in this space. They haven't pursued this before. So in identifying those gaps and challenges, then that will hopefully signal to the data providers and the research community where there are opportunities to fill in that white space. So today's session is on mining and extractives, and I think I'm really excited. We've got a really great panel today. We've got representatives from Vale. We've got representatives from Anglo American. So two very large mining companies that have been doing this for a very long time and have a lot of experience. And then we have a number of data providers. We've got Alison Osborne from Dendra. We've got Chris Gentle on the line from Australia. So thank you, Chris, from WABC CF. We've got Ed Ellis from IBAT, Ver Ross-Gillespie from Nature Metrics, and Sylvain Vanston from MSCI. So a really amazing panel, actually. I'm quite impressed. First, before I get started, we want to make this interactive. So what we'll do is we'll introduce the panelists. They'll have an opportunity to explain to you what they've been doing, how their platforms work, what their experience has been. And then we'll have some questions. So I'll probably try to facilitate a guided discussion with them. But we also want to encourage you in the audience to ask questions and to engage in that dialogue. So we'll hear from them, and we'll get into a bit of a dialogue. And then what we're going to do, and this has actually been the most impactful part of these data labs, is we'll break out into working groups afterwards. And so we'll probably set up about 4 or so working groups and challenge you with some questions that we want you to try to answer and discuss amongst yourselves. And then we'll collect this information. And what we're doing is we're capturing all of this information from these 8 sessions, and we'll synthesize this into some outcomes from this week that will help inform the Data Catalyst initiative. So we know who you guys are, but I'm interested to know who's in the audience. So can you put up your hand if you are from a mining company? One person from a mining company, okay. Other corporates? Another corporate, okay. Which sector? Space data, okay, great. Nature data providers or aggregators, provision. Okay, we've got a couple here. Good. What about financial services? Do we have people from the FI sector? Okay, excellent. That's interesting. Not-for-profits, advocacy groups. Okay, good. Professional services, myself, a couple. All right, good. So you can see there's a good mix here of the end users, financial institutions, financial services, representatives from industry, as well as the data providers and the people that will be working with them. So with that, let's get started. Guilherme, I'm going to start with you. So please, if you could tell us a bit about yourself and the work that you're doing with Vale.
Okay, Dan, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I like to see biologists wearing suits. We should be in these places. Well, contrary to what it says, I'm a biologist as well. So I am the head of the Vale Institute of Technology. We are a private nonprofit research institute maintained by Vale, but we operate pretty much like an academic institution. So what we do is we do science and we publish science, we share data. So I think we are on the base of what's being discussed here. And what I want to get out of this discussion is how we can do it better, engage with people like yourselves better. So in 30 seconds, what we do, if you look at Earth from space, we start looking at our operations from space and getting measurements from satellite data, going down to the ground. There's no way we can do this without getting our boots dirty. So we get suits off and boots on. And so we measure trees, we collect specimens. There is a huge gap in the knowledge of what are the species where we operate. So I can give you examples on that. So without that, I mean, what can you say about nature? So we go molecular. We use heavily molecular tools to identify species, to do genomics, population genetics, generate barcodes, do eDNA, and we do social work, we do geochemistry. So those are some of the ecological information. Those are some of the types of data we collect. Now, as you all know, we need to use standards. For some of these data, there are standards available. For others, we are creating, so we're publishing in that space as well. And then we integrate data. So we have a data lake where everything goes in. We try to resuscitate data, get old impact assessment data, which is a nightmare. It needs heavily curation and it's hidden in places that is hard to find. And then we are creating tools to help the company to use this data and understand what this impact is. But we want this data to be available for others as well. So it's not something that's going to be hiding in our servers. And the users of standards and having data lakes where you can use APIs to use that data will be really important. So that's in a nutshell what we are doing. Thank you.
It's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Alison with Dendra. So Alison, could you tell us a bit about Dendra and how you've been working with the mining industry?
Thanks, Dan. Welcome, everybody. And yeah, I'd just like to share that view that it's been such a privilege to be involved in these sessions this week. We work, Dendra, so I'm Alison Osborne, I'm from Australia, if that's not obvious by my accent. Dendra works with, I think, almost all of the mining companies in Australia. We also work in other jurisdictions around the world, in the Middle East and in the UK, and we're very keen to work with mining companies in North America. So if you're interested after our session this morning, then please reach out. So what we currently do, and I guess one of the reasons that we're here is to really understand how we adapt what we're currently doing with the mining industry into what's required for the TNFD. And I'm really thinking hard about that and really interested to hear back from mining clients about how they see that sort of transition from the current data use to that TNFD framework working. But we are an environmental tech company. We use high resolution imagery using drones and other aerial methods to collect imagery. And we take that imagery from the whole of the site. So I guess there's a few biologists in the room. Where we differ, I guess, from field-based work, and we obviously have field ecologists as well, is that we take data from 100% of the site rather than just a few plots, so 1% of the site, which is usually what happens when we undertake field verified methods. We take that data from 100% of the site. And then we stitch that data together and we feed it through an ecology trained AI platform, which we train to identify species. So really dependent on what the clients require in terms of, is it native species they're after, or is it invasive flora and fauna species that they're after? And then we provide a whole lot of data insights based on that data. And that might be extent of weeds, extent of veg communities. It might be area classification based on restoration projects. So really the metrics and analytics are really based on looking at the baseline measures of that site, designing those restoration projects and then monitoring those restoration projects over time. It'd be great to have some slides, but we don't. So if you're interested in just understanding that a little bit better, then reach out or go to our website. There's some information there. But super keen to hear, I guess, today or after the session, just about specific requirements in relation to the TNFD, as I mentioned. We are involved in a pitch with ICMM for a pilot. So we are sort of starting to get our hands dirty in this space. So super keen to expand on that. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Alison. That's great. So, you know, we've heard from Vale, we've heard from you where you're providing kind of entire 100% coverage using aerial drone imagery and I think supplementing with satellite imagery as well, their high resolution satellite.
Yeah, we do use a range of different options. So we've used Earth observation and satellite data, particularly around AGB, so above ground biomass. So we sort of see the AGB or the carbon metrics as part of the biodiversity space. It's sort of fits in rather than the other way around. I know the whole market is not designed in that way. So we use a whole range of different options. The satellite data is not yet able to, we can't train satellite data to identify at species level. So we have to rely on higher resolution imagery.
So let's go to Ver. And we'll get into the actual site level monitoring space here. So we're sort of going from the ground level, scaling up through the data collection journey, I guess. So maybe you could tell us a bit about Nature Metrics and the eDNA technology that you're working with.
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming. So I'm an aquatic ecologist. Nice to have other biologists in the room as well. I'm from South Africa, and I work with a company called Nature Metrics. I head up the work we do in the extractive sector, so mining, oil and gas, onshore, offshore. And really, what our company is focusing on is providing biodiversity data. You know, as Guilherme said, we've got a fundamental problem. You might have heard people say that we've got lots of biodiversity data at COP, and in fact, that's not true. We've got a lot of Earth observation data. There is a lot of that, and it's absolutely critical data. But what we are lacking is data on the ground at scale and across much of the forms of life that we have. You know, I think if you think about fauna, if I ask you to think about animals, probably the first thing that'll come to mind are some fluffy, furry vertebrates. You probably weren't thinking about the invertebrates or the eukaryotes or the fungi or the bacteria, and that's the massive majority of what our ecosystems are comprising of. So what we're trying to do with eDNA and metabarcoding is apply this technology at scale across sites to gather the complete picture of biodiversity at a site. And this can be from soil samples, it can be from water samples, it can be from benthic marine sediments, it can be from marine water, even from air. And we're starting to do this with companies to really start to fill in the gaps. Conventional biodiversity monitoring does have many gaps. It's fundamental data, and we can now start to augment that with eDNA data. We can then collate it with some of the Earth observation data that you're collecting, Alison, and we depend on some of the R&D work that Vale is doing and barcode libraries from different countries. But really what we're doing is applying this across all stages of the mitigation hierarchy and across all of the stages of a project's life cycle and asset length, you know, if you're talking about life of mine. So similar to Alison, we can start to apply this at sites where there's restoration. We can track this restoration over time. We can start to do it at scale over very large landscapes, looking at net positive impact. And we've started to take this data and turn it into useful and meaningful metrics for the finance industry, which is so important. And together with this, we've also then formed a partnership with IUCN to make this data available, transparent and open source. And this is the eBioAtlas platform. And it's been an absolute pleasure working with Anglo American, who really are the first company who've made the commitment to have this data fed through into the eBioAtlas, so that it doesn't just sit in a PDF and go onto someone's shelf and die. So really, we're about trying to now share this data, create these platforms where people and researchers and the like can come and use it. Yeah, thanks, Dan. That's great.
Thanks, Fer. So it's interesting because we're sort of moving up through the scales here. But one of the things I think that this common theme we've heard throughout these data lab sessions is the need for making these data available to others, to partners that are also operating in a particular area. And this concept of cumulative impacts or understanding what your context is, what of your operations within the context of the larger region that you're operating in. So I'm going to turn to Chris now from MobCF in Western Australia to tell us a bit more about what you're doing there. And really, you're trying to tackle this challenge around how do you assess cumulative impacts? How do you accumulate and obtain these data in a structured way to make it available for organizations to do these kinds of assessments?
Thanks, Dan, and good evening or good morning, wherever you are. I'm coming to you from Margaret River in Western Australia today, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. My name is Chris Gentle. I'm the Information Management Director for the WA Biodiversity Science Institute, which is an interesting organisation. It's a joint venture of around 12 members. It incorporates universities, state government, CSIRO, and some industry partners also. Being WA based, we are obviously maybe not obviously, for those who aren't aware, WA is a heavily based extractive state. So the Pilbara region with iron ore exports generate by far and away the majority of the income for our particular state. And that creates a wonderful set of opportunities and codependencies between all industry and community, I suppose, in WA and the mining sector itself. Part of our challenge now in Western Australia has been as we progress from thinking about projects in isolation in terms of either approvals or monitoring or assessment, or moving increasingly towards state of environment reporting on country or accounting. How do we start thinking about things in a regional context? And we've had a very structured way of going about this. I'm very much in partnership with our research institutions and our industry partners. So if I could tell you just a brief story, because it may have some relevance back to the specific conversation. Around 5 years ago, we started a journey to digitally transform how the state undertakes environmental impact assessment or environmental assessment. So that's in the regulatory side of things in terms of project approvals, project reporting, project monitoring, and eventually, I think we mentioned life of mine, mine site closeout, and shutdown and rehabilitation. And a big part of that, working through that particular process of understanding that digital transformation, was how can we make best use of the data that is collected by the mining companies, the various consultancies and their research partners, either as part of an assessment process or a monitoring process or reporting process, working its way through. And someone mentioned previously PDFs and the challenges around PDFs. We've had a long history in our state of people doing an awful lot of fantastic science and data collection, and then submitting very, very large PDFs to the regulator, whose only form of data science has been Control-F in Adobe. So you've had this discrepancy between the data that is collected and how we can put that data to work. So one of our key challenges in the last 5 years, specifically, it's been running for longer than that, but our recent involvement since 2017 has been heavily biased towards how do we create a culture whereby we're encouraging and fostering data sharing. That includes dealing with the legal issues, trailing liabilities, all the fun things around licensing and copyright. Standards around data and data collection for the surveys themselves, plus the actual data. Finding a trusted, funded, sustainable source of folk who can curate that data and take it from individual surveys and start to tidy it up so we can put it to work, so that we can integrate it and get it ready for analytics and forecasting and reporting. And one of the wonderful, I think, offerings which we would like to put forward to the group today, going back to 2018, we've had a very large culture change happening in our state, which has been led by a lot of the mining companies, specific reference here to BHP and Rio Tinto, who had been leaning into opening up access to their biodiversity data that's collected for the purpose of impact assessment or impact monitoring or reporting inside Western Australia. So since 2018, those companies and any other organisation associated with formal regulatory impact assessment now submit their biodiversity surveys. So they actually submit the raw survey data, the metadata, the survey boundaries, and any science-related reports. They all get submitted to the regulator. Regulator's job, apart from doing the assessment, is to tidy those up and put them online, which they've done. And then next stages in that I'll come to. I did a recent check with this is all publicly available. As of yesterday, since we started that process, there's 1,686 biodiversity surveys and science reports and metadata, all the geospatial information, science information that's been available and put forward. And next step in that, though, was to make that data workable. So our state government, in partnership with our Commonwealth government, has invested into a thing called a Biodiversity Information Office, or a BIO, who, being a mining group, is modelled on the geological surveys, whose job is to do what geological surveys do for geoscience data, but to do it for biodiversity data. So they pick up the data from the individual companies, the individual surveys. They combine it with state data and research data. They curate that, and they publish that using online methods, services, etc., such that we can start to put it to work. And the urgency for this, and one of the reasons why this is becoming increasingly of import, is we've had a change in our legislation about 2 years ago, where we now have to consider the cumulative impact, as Dan mentioned, of any project. So no longer do we consider in our state a project in isolation in relation to its neighbours. It now needs to be considered formally in a cumulative sense, both in terms of its neighbours, but also in terms of region, which is a very similar parallel, I guess, to some of the challenges that TNFD is looking to help address. In terms of understanding how and reporting how is an individual asset or an individual company travelling in terms of their journey towards net positive, but also how is a region in context working both in terms of its journey towards net positive, but how an organisation compares or contrasts in relation to a regional set of baselines. So we're working hard with those partners in that particular context to determine how we can help the proponents with their efficiency of their proposals, with the regulators with confidence in the decisions that they're making and the conditions that they're setting on various projects as they go forward. And lastly, reporting. And reporting for us comes in three forms. There's the ESG TNFD style of reporting, as we said. There'll be state of environment, which will be transparency for public and community. And importantly, very much in our state also, is acknowledging our traditional owners and enabling reporting on country, reporting on native title determination areas, which is a cumulative task. Thanks, Dan.
That's a wonderful description of the initiative that you have around the Western Australia Biodiversity Science Institute. We've had a conversation about this before, but I think it's these kinds of regional, state level entities that are really going to be necessary in order to encourage the sharing and curation of the data that's going to be needed for organizations to really understand their contribution and cumulative impact. So I'd love to sort of maybe later explore this sort of concept a bit more in terms of a voluntary context. It's not all countries will have this regulatory framework in order to enable that. So we're going to go even higher up in the scale. And Ed, can you tell us a bit about IBAT and how IBAT is being used by the mining industry to look at critical sites, biodiversity hotspots, I guess is a good way to call them.
Thanks, Dan. This is really exciting for me to see such a Southern Hemisphere dominated panel. It makes for a refreshing change from a lot of the panels that I've been on so far. So nice to see some familiar faces and hear some friendly accents. We're now taking a step up to the more global level, and I'm representing the conservation community, so the non-profit community in this conversation as well. IBAT is the integrated biodiversity assessment tool, and what it is really a map-based web and reporting platform that enables easy, fast, and integrated access to critical biodiversity information. And this is curated and provided by 4 global conservation organizations in the form of IUCN, UNEP WCMC, Conservation International, and BirdLife International. We hold 3 of the most globally authoritative biodiversity data sets: the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas, and the World Database on Protected Areas. And where IBAT fits into sort of this broader data landscape that we're painting a picture of is really at that global rapid assessment state. What IBAT allows you to do with global coverage of data sets, with the ability to sort of quickly screen across a portfolio, is to start to undertake this high-level prioritization aspect. We've heard a lot about what you can do once you know sort of where you're operating and the gaps that we have with biodiversity data and sort of filling in the corners. Where IBAT really comes into this space is at that first initial step, and thinking about TNFD's LEAP framework, specifically on that L2 and L3, locating your interface with nature. And we've been doing this for quite some time, and particularly with the mining and extractive sector. IBAT's been around since 2006. We've been working with the extractive sector for almost as long. Both Vale and Anglo American have been longtime supporters and users of IBAT, which is very exciting for us. But where IBAT is really valuable, and for a couple of different communities we have here, I'll first talk about the mining. sector, because this is the panel that we're on, but the ability to get access to globally authoritative biodiversity data to start to understand what's your potential biodiversity related risk. Where are you operating either near or overlapping with key biodiversity areas? So areas of special significance for biodiversity on the planet. Where are you overlapping or in proximity to protected areas, which might have regulatory implications for your operations? And then drawing on the ICN Red List, what are the potential species that you're likely to be finding within these particular sites? If you don't know what you're looking for, then the task of monitoring becomes a lot more challenging. So how can you use the globally authoritative biodiversity data from the IUCN Red List to start to inform how you're going to be using eDNA to scope your surveys, how you're going to be using your remote observation, whether it's Earth observation or your drone satellite imagery, to start to target or to know sort of what you're looking for in terms of species. And then we also have the species threat abatement and restoration metric, or STAR. Apologies, it's the end of a long couple of weeks. And what STAR is really designed to do is take the rich compendium of information from the IUCN Red List and start to identify what are the threats that are facing species, what are the opportunities you have for reducing those threats, and how do you start to quantify species extinction risk. We also have quite a few people from the financial services sector here. And so what I might also just touch on is how this sort of global data sets can be used by the finance community when you're thinking about looking at the mining industry in particular. The advantages of these global data sets is that, as the name suggests, they're global, they're equally applicable across the global landscape. And so we've been partnering with ESG data providers to start to combine the biodiversity data that we hold with the asset level information that they have compiled on the extractive sector as a whole. So one I'll talk about is RepRisk, where RepRisk has an asset level database of about 70,000 extractive assets. That's oil and gas, that's metals and mining. We're combining that with information on protected areas and key biodiversity areas to start to enable financial institutions to see, when you're investing in a mining company, what's the potential exposure? How do you, as a financial institution, start to report on your TNFD requirements, particularly on sort of the locate your interface with nature? What are the opportunities you have for engagement? What are the potential risks that you're facing? And so starting to aggregate together with other players in this space.
That's a really good segue into Sylvain and MSCI, which as a data aggregator, as an ESG rating provider, maybe you could tell us a bit about how MSCI is working with organizations like IBAT, but also aggregating and taking into consideration the large mass of data at multiple scales in order to provide decision useful information for investors, for financial services, and also for corporates themselves.
Sure, thanks, and thanks for inviting me. So I'm Sylvain Manson. I work in the climate and biodiversity research teams at MSCI. MSCI is a large data provider of ESG ratings, research, but also a large provider of indices. A lot of our clients are passive investors. So I'm not a biologist. I'm not a mining engineer. But what I can talk about is what our global clients ask us. So we have about 1,700 clients on the ESG and climate side. And they are large insurers, asset owners, asset managers, banks, and they're nowhere near as sophisticated as we are in this panel, generally speaking. Some are pioneers, but the general demand for the data that we've been discussing this morning is just emerging now. So there's increasingly demand for some sort of overarching biodiversity solution, single metric. Of course, that doesn't exist. So we have to use proxies. We have to use a number of side issues. And actually, we have been collecting data from issuers worldwide for many, many years on biodiversity-related topics. It's just not packaged as such. So, for example, through the ESG ratings, our clients would access a lot of pretty specific data points, industry by industry, on biodiversity and land use, on water stress, on toxic emissions, etc. And this they can play with to combine, in their own internal research or for engagement purposes and so on, sometimes for divestment. There's also an increasing demand for asset location database, asset location data. which we are building, of course, and it's nowhere near as precise as we would like it to be. So we have started to work with external partners to make sure that we have much better and precise information about what those assets are, exactly where they are, how to map them, for example, to what you were saying, what you do at IBAT with specific databases that could correlate to fragile ecosystems, for example. So that is work that is new and emerging for MSCI, for most of our peers. But we see huge growing demand from our client base on those issues since pretty much just last year. I mean, this is very new. My intuition is that COP15 is also very much helping on the awareness raising amongst our clients. I mean, we get a lot of questions from our clients about what is going on in Montreal. And of course, we got a lot of questions about the TNFD framework, which is obviously will be live next September, but it's we know that it's going to be probably a very promising framework. You know, MSCI typically would provide our clients with solutions to report against the TNFD framework, including the LEAP framework. So that is what we do. Again, as I said, I'm not a mining expert, so I would have to defer to our internal, industry specialists. But we do have industry specialists that then go into, organizations like Valley or Anglo to understand what is going on in the ground. And for this, we use reported data. But we also use data that is, we only use public data, but we also use typically data reported by NGOs, by the media, by special organizations. And this is how we build the data that is then packaged, not so much in terms of raw data, but organized data for our clients.
Thank you, Sylvain. So, Warwick, I've saved you for last. And understanding that you are a member of the TNFD, so you have a very good understanding of the disclosure framework, the LEAP framework, some of the challenges around data and the analytics that are required. Also, Anglo is piloting the TNFD framework as well, and I'm hoping that you can tell us a bit about the experience that you've had and Anglo have had over the years, and more recently with the TNFD. And try to pull all of this together for us. So this idea that you have the data aggregators, the ESG ratings agencies that are providing kind of almost in some cases cross-sectoral information that investors are relying on, through to the global biodiversity footprinting and biodiversity tools that are available, right down through to the geospatial interpretation, and even to site level eDNA and site level monitoring. There's a huge sort of sphere of data that needs to be analyzed and integrated and looked at in different ways. But perhaps you could try to pull all of this together for us and tell us about your experience.
Thanks, Dan. And I guess to add a familiar voice from South Africa, so part of the Anglo-American's team as biodiversity principal, but based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I think we've had a very long association with biodiversity data, global information. As Ed had said, in the very early days of using IBAT, we were part of, I guess, a group of other extractives, primarily, to set up the Proteus Partnership, which is a partnership with the UN Environment Programme and the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, specifically to how do we use the biodiversity data and information that we can get from these global data sets like the database on protected areas, IUCN Red List and others, to help inform not only our management decisions. I think, historically, obviously a lot around risk, probably less around opportunity. And what we're seeing now is that there's far more focus on the opportunity side. And how do we maximize the value of this biodiversity data that we can get from these varying sources, institutions, service providers, but to help us make and inform some of those very important decisions. And then, as you said as well, I think we kind of felt if we wanted to be part of building a TNFD framework that has an extractive or a mining and extractive sector focus, we really need to be part of the development of the framework, and hopefully bring in some of the lessons learned and I guess a real industry perspective in terms of what works, what those needs are. So quite a lot of what we've done in the past outside of a TNFD was very much around risk and opportunity assessment at that sort of very early locate phase. Using a tool like RBAT, I think is widely used within our grouping, and it really does give you a really good desktop-based assessment of both risk and opportunity at that scale. I mean, I think where we're getting to now is obviously using a lot more in-field technology, like Vera was saying around eDNA, and a bit of Chris to what you were talking about, getting the on-the-ground data that had been fed into things like environmental impact assessments, which historically, they have ended up as PDFs. The data isn't shared, and the sad reality is that companies and literally neighbors across the fence end up doing the same studies on the same areas and not sharing information, which is something that we've been working on. So, Dan, I mean, I think what we would like to see is definitely, yes, how companies can use the LEAP framework, and more importantly, use it. I think where we're getting to now is disclosing on some of those nature-related dependencies and impacts, but location specific. Yes, there are some challenges around that, and obviously some sensitivities around the information sharing. Some of the other challenges are obviously indirect impacts, the sort of upstream, downstream. When you look at your entire life cycle and value chain, that's where it becomes a little bit more difficult to get access to that data. But it is work that we've, as an industry, been engaging with. Most recently, done a bit of work with WWF around a risk filter based on their water filter, and I know that they're hoping to launch that early next year. And just provide literally from a sector some of the requirements and some of the lessons that we've had in the past, and how we can build on a framework like within TNFD and the development, very sector specific guidance. And so how as you as an extractive company can go in and understand and get access exactly what you need, and then as an analyst as well, is to be able to say, how can we compare across the extractive sector, apples with apples. And I think that's really the piece of work that we're working together with the TNFD, and a lot of the sort of working group and the sector specific outputs. So yeah, I mean, we've probably covered a little bit of what everybody's done. I mean, from what Alison was saying around Dendra, a lot of focus around the restoration and the rehab work. Yes, I think there's still a lot that we can do there, and importantly, build that into the sort of end of life land use planning tool to be able to help, as I say, focus more on the opportunity as opposed to some of the risk-based metrics that have been used in the past. But yeah, let me pause there, and yeah, looking forward to really getting into the discussion and some of the meat of it. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Warwick. I think you touched on something really interesting, which is, well, the need to have data available and the sharing of data and getting data, out of the PDFs, off the shelf, into usable data formats, databases that are following a common protocol, a common standard, so that they are accessible to others. The other thing I think you touched on as well, and others, is there's the concept that you have assessment and assessment metrics, which are typically done internally by an organization to understand, where their impacts are, where the dependencies are, how that translates into risk. But then there's also the need to produce disclosures and disclosure metrics, which can be compared across an industry, across a sector, but also potentially across sectoral. So one of the other things I think that's really challenging in this space is understanding, when you're trying to understand the state of nature. I think we've talked a lot about different types of monitoring and measuring tools. We've heard from Alison from Dendra that are using high resolution imagery and AI to classify and understand what the vegetation composition is. There's eDNA tools to understand what species are present. But maybe to start off the conversation, could you from the panelists, what's your perspective on how do we then compare that monitoring information back to some reference state of what good looks like, or what is a functioning ecosystem? Should we be involving IPLCs, Indigenous people and local communities, in that definition? What's the role of government or academia, and how do you interact with them in order to get that? So let me put that question out to the panel and see if anybody has any. It's not an easy one. Okay, please go ahead.
Easy, but excellent question. Okay, I'm on. That's an excellent question, because I mean, counting species is a good thing. Knowing what the species are is primordial for that. But let me give you a couple examples on how we are looking at it. One tool is eDNA. Obviously, you can get measurements of species content and then follow this measure throughout time and see if it changes, if something happens, and we can compare it to the site as it originally was, or nearby sites that you have some baseline information. And for that, we do have good standards for data sharing, from the raw data all the way to species occurrence data. That's one way of doing it. Another approach that we've been using is soundscapes. It's analogous to what eDNA is, but you measure the sounds of the environment. You can get very good measures of the types of species that are frogs, birds, mammals, and whatever. And you can also pick up on things you shouldn't be hearing, like chainsaws, right? Yeah. Another way of measuring is looking at bacteria. So we've been doing that extensively to look at two things: soil health, and we have very good ways of addressing that problem, nutrient cycle in the soil. If that doesn't go well, the rest will suffer. We can also access mechanisms of carbon storage in the soil. We've been looking at that carefully, and how we can perhaps push the system towards what it should be looking like when it's good. And we have been doing that, looking at chronosequences of land being recuperated compared to the primary site. And also using, this may sound Greek to some of you, but metaproteomics. It's analogous to what eDNA is, looking at genes or genetic signals. We're looking at protein signals, and that gives us functional information. So for soil, for example, it gives us excellent signals as to how soil is behaving. So those are some of the measures. In addition to, I think that's what Alison was mentioning, using drones, and I think you also use hyperspectral cameras to access species diversity. So sometimes you can get to species, but you can get a very good sense of what's on the ground. So those are some of the approaches we've been using. Now, just to finish, one last one on bees. So bees may be more important than us on this planet, and we should be looking at them carefully. And so, I mean, you have to sit in front of a flower and look who's visiting this flower. That's tough work. We can use eDNA for that. We can collect eDNA from the flowers and see who's been visiting that flower, and also collect pollen from the bees and see which flowers the bees have visited. But how do we report this data? There is no standard for that. And if we are to consider bees in this, in what we're talking about, we should. So we published recently a paper on that to help on the field. So these are some of the examples. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Guilherme. I think Ver, you wanted to speak, and then Warwick, you've got your hand up there, so we'll get to you after. Ver.
Sure. Guilherme has beautifully kind of showcased exactly how you can use these different tools to get that data, and he's also talked about the data standards. But the second part of your question was around the role of traditional knowledge, Indigenous communities, the role of governments and the like. And I I think absolutely right. I mean, just some conversations with ICMM. There's probably going to be a kind of a review and a rewrite of the statement on the role of traditional knowledge and indigenous communities and that information coming to the fore. One lovely way in which we're doing this with some of these companies is to use eDNA to actually involve stakeholders in a way that they haven't been involved before in biodiversity monitoring. So incorporating them into the actual taking of the sample to the extent that we can explain what it does, we can get information from them about what they expect to see and what lives in an environment, and then we can share that data back with them afterwards and start to engage. But it also leads to kind of the collaboration cross-sector, you know, where we've got forestry right next to a mining site, or where we've got agriculture right next to mining sites. There's wonderful opportunities to use technologies like eDNA and proteomics and really start to engage with cross-sector kind of industry role players and the like. So that would be through looking at mandated research from universities, growing the scale of what we're looking at as well, beyond just the site or the lease area of a mine. We need to understand the buffer area. You know, we need to go beyond that. We need to understand catchments. We need to understand landscape level approaches. And this is what we've started doing when we're looking at INPI. And what it does is it leads to collaboration. We can't do this if we're not collaborating, if companies are not sharing data and speaking with each other. So
yeah, this is a very important theme, I think, is collaboration and partnerships and the need for data sharing for the greater good. Warwick, you had your hand up.
I mean, the benchmarking or the baselining against a point in time is absolutely critical, particularly when we're seeing more and more targets and I guess sort of disclosures made around, be it, you know, aiming for a net gain or a net positive impact or even no net loss. And what's coming out now, nature positive, is you know, progress against that. And so there's a state, and it's absolutely vitally important that we can measure the changes back to that. And so critically important to have that at a national and a regional scale. As an example, with our regulator in South Africa, we've been working with them around a screening tool that all developers have to use as a step in their EIA process, to demonstrate that they've used this national screening tool, which uses our national biodiversity data sets and the best available data, so that there can be no, well, obviously at a screening level, there can be no gaps in what the proposed development is, and straight away be able to say these are the risks and opportunities within that landscape. But then at least have that as your baseline, as your baseline to measure impacts against, and then obviously any of your targets around net gain or net positive impacts going forward is critically important to be able to go back to that to disclose on, and then in terms of your progress to meeting that, to be able to say, you know, a particular ecosystem that has X number of species in it of whatever status, how has that changed over time as a result of your inputs and hopefully collaboratively as well around a landscape level change that we're going to have to do and see at that ecosystem level to get some of those gains to be able to demonstrate progress against.
Yeah, you're talking about this concept of what are the thresholds at which you either have to manage to avoid or you have to get above in order to affect that kind of change. And you know, much like with net zero and science-based targets for decarbonization, the SBTN will be requiring that, you know, if you are setting targets, there's a question about whether you're setting those targets relative to a threshold, and what is the science behind how that threshold has been established. And so, you know, as we get into target setting, which is part of the TNFD, there'll be a real need for information about how those thresholds have been established. And you know, it speaks to what we've been talking about earlier about the the science behind this and how this information is being interpreted, what the reference sites are. Chris, you've had your hand up. Would you like to say a few words on this?
Thanks, Dan. Briefly, if I could, just to extend some of Warwick's logic. One of our challenges that we're finding in terms of going cumulative, of actually trying to understand the cumulative impact of what is both currently occurring, which has to incorporate a hindcast. You have to understand the history to incorporate that into the current baseline. But the real challenge we're finding with cumulative is, of course, it's forecasting. So you're actually asking both a company and a regulator and a community, and that includes First Nations or traditional owners in that space, to have to forecast or predict what do we think the impact will be of this new disruption in an environment that is already well disrupted in many cases, either through natural events or economic type development. So one of the challenges, we're doing quite a lot of work on working out how we can operationalize some of these data flows and some of the forecasting tools to make those things work. And to where Warwick was going in terms of the shared data and having shared spatial tools, etc. One of the things that we're working quite actively on that may be of interest more broadly is how do you have shared modelling and forecasting around specific type events. So one of the ones we're working on now is hydrodynamics and ecosystem modelling in the marine space, of how can you have a shared model such that, for example, when new proponents come in, they can run their model, look at their boundary conditions and their disturbances, and use that as a means of presenting to our regulator a key phrase that we fall back on a lot: what is reasonably foreseeable, which is some of the language that's in our legislation. So what is the reasonably foreseeable disruption that this new disturbance will have on a given region? Or plain English, I want to put in a new mine and tailings, etc., and a railway line and a road and everything else. What is reasonably foreseeable that my impact will be, and how do I attempt to forecast that over life of mine in cumulative context? And of course, if you're a regulator that has to consider the cumulative, that's a much more complex challenge than just one organisation, because of course they have to take into consideration, what organisation, 1 through N is doing in a given region, bearing in mind the conditions of these events these sites are operating and changing and being reported against. So it becomes a very dynamic and very living type of a framework and a model that we're trying to put forward. And I guess one of the things just to throw into that mix, just to support that, comes back to some of the things which we haven't really touched on so much as yet, around legislative standards and requirements to help provide framework and certainty for proponents and TNFD type customers. We've touched on the importance of getting environmental data from diverse sources. Again, we have lots of examples that we can offer up around Indigenous range programs for data collection, and those being well supported by extractive companies as means of collecting. And the last one I would really just touch there is the value of the science and the trust in the science that underpins all that work, because it's very easy to put out a forecast. But if the forecast of the cumulative impact is not trusted, it's not underpinned by certified professionals, etc., working through, you do more harm than good. So it's a complex space.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. So I think we've talked a lot about assessment and how the mining and extractives industry, the challenges around assessing and understanding impacts for the business, the need for cumulative assessment and sharing of information. I think we have quite a few financial institutions in the room who are probably scratching your head saying, how do I make sense of all of this complex information? Like what are your expectations about what you want to see from the companies that you're working with? Understanding that there will be disclosure metrics that will probably be very, very high level, cross-sectoral, but potentially also sector-specific metrics. There'll be information about targets that companies are setting. You'll be probably relying on data providers like MSCI or doing high-level global assessments using tools like IBAT. But are there anybody from the financial services who might want to comment on that? And based on what you've seen today, what you see maybe the challenges are, and you know, pose to the panel here, how they might see helping you to solve that challenge. Over there, yes. Here, I'll pass you my mic.
Thank you very much. Oh, yes, yes. My name is Hirotaka Hideshima. I work for the Norin Chukin Bank. It's one of the new TNFD members. You know, the TNFD expanded its membership from 34 to 40 now. One left, so there are 7 new members. I'm one of the 7. And has been a great conversation. I'm learning a lot. I'm starting to understand what I'm getting into. Very useful. And so my question would be, so some of you have talked about the risks and opportunities to the companies that are using your data. And my question is, what are those risks and opportunities for those companies? Because my understanding is that probably the risks and opportunities for the companies are not aligned with the risks and opportunities for the planet. And that's why we're getting into this trouble, right? And so I think one of the things that we'll have to be struggling with will be, how do we align those, or how do we introduce a regulation so that companies will not be following their risks and opportunities without those regulations. And so my question is, what are the risks and opportunities for those companies that they're looking at, especially in terms of the biological data that they're looking at? So, one could say that there is no risk because, up until now, everything was free. Natural resources were free, and that's why we got into this problem. But if you could, because some of you talked about the risks and opportunities.
It's a great question, and it speaks to this concept of materiality as well, which is a very challenging topic depending on which side of the world that you sit in. But and any thoughts on risks and opportunities and how those are being currently assessed, how they could be assessed and communicated? Ver? Yeah.
It is a good question. I'm going to try my best here. I guess what you've got is risk for the company, all right? Which would be the first part of that would be you either don't disclose any data and it dies. It sits in a PDF, so nothing gets shared. That's one risk, and that's a risk for the planet, actually. The risk for the company following on from that would be that you don't know what species are at a site, and you end up going and building a mine, and then 10 years later, you find out that there's a critical species there that you didn't pick up on. That then has an issue for compliance, which is a risk to the company and a risk to the planet. So that's kind of a duality. So I guess what we're needing to do is to be as careful and as sensitive as we can to species data. And I think for a long time, biodiversity has been kind of at the bottom of the ESG pile. In fact, it's been water or something else, water usage that's been very high up and still is very high up. Yeah, absolutely. And I think now what's happening is people are waking up to the fact that water, ecosystems, all of these things are absolutely fundamentally linked to the biodiversity. So there's an increasing focus on it. So yeah, I'll kind of stop there because I think the other panelists might have something else to say on this, but there's dual risks to the planet, risks to the company, and biodiversity sits in the middle of that.
Well, and those risks are linked, right? Yeah. Like you said, if you impact the environment, there could be compliance or reputational issues that translate into financial impacts. Yeah.
Correct. That's TNFD. That's why it's only part of it. Yeah.
Yep. So I'll give you a couple numbers to exemplify this. In one of the sites where Vale operates, the initial impact assessments identified 200 species of plants on that site. But we knew that the basic science to support that work wasn't there. So we did the basic science and, well, let's describe all the flora of the site. We ended up with 1,106 species. Not all endemic because we looked elsewhere. So if you are operating at a site and only look there, everything you find will be new, of course. So we have to expand and look elsewhere. And then you see actually the number of endemics decreased because we found them elsewhere. Now that we have a list of endemics, we can address those species. If they are going to be impacted, if their habitat is going to be impacted, we need to first understand, are these new species, which are they? And we had the opportunity to describe new species in that way. And then how do we manage this? We need to understand the basic biology of these species, from germinating seeds to phenology, how the plant physiology is throughout its life cycle, what is the life cycle density of the populations, genetics of the populations. And that minimizes the risk for the company, because now you have a handle on the species, you know what you need to protect and how to go about doing that. And you minimize the risk for the environment, because you can assure that the species will not be lost on the planet. So that's, I think it's an interesting example. And then the companies can commit to protecting areas that are extra to what's legally mandated. And I think many companies have been doing that, and Vale is committed to protect an additional 500,000 hectares to what it already does. And then you can measure what's being protected in there.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ed, and then I think James is going to ask a question.
Brilliant, thanks. Just to add to the conversation here, we've been talking a lot about the impacts. We've got the impacts that operations might have on the environment. We've got the potential impact that those operations could have on sort of on the companies themselves, whether it's regulatory risk, whether it's operational risk. What we haven't really talked about is the dependency piece, and the fact that we've got companies that are depending on biodiversity, on nature, for their license to operate. And there are tools out there like Encore, which do help start to unpack that sort of dependency side of things. But then the really thorny question is, how do you translate these impacts? How do you translate these dependencies, that double materiality component, into financial risk? How do you start to put sort of a dollar valuation on what does this actually mean for financial investors? There's a really exciting piece of work, and this is, again, drawing together on sort of the collaboration aspect that has been one of the running themes of the TNFD Data Lab sessions. There's a really exciting collaboration between S&P and UNEP WCMC in particular on creating an open access methodology called the Nature Risk Profile, which is starting to try and tackle some of these questions of how do you combine impacts, dependency, proximity, regulatory risk, and start bundling it up into something that can be translated to the financial sector community. So this is something that is hopefully going to be released early next year. It's going to be open access. We're hoping for broad scale adoption across the finance sector, something that is designed to be built so that it can be adopted by ESG data providers, that they can plug and play their data into it to help inform that decision. But really trying to sort of bring together a bunch of these different discussions on the impact side, on the dependency side, on the various level of risks, whether we're talking about risk to biodiversity or risks to the company.
Before we go to James' work, I think you had something to add.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go to James, I mean, I think somebody mentioned just around the co-benefits, in particular around some of the carbon opportunities that there are. And I again, probably, sit more on the opportunity side, is you mustn't underestimate the power and the value of looking at that landscape level opportunity, particularly when it comes to some of the carbon work. So I mean, Guillermo could probably attest as well in terms of Vale and some of the operations that we have in South America around some of the restoration work that can be done around and securing future carbon and carbon offsets, but also looking at the co-benefit value from a biodiversity perspective. So not only addressing some of the emissions risk, but also tagging on to that some of the biodiversity value and opportunity added, as well as livelihoods. So I think, really looking at a landscape level, really looking at multiple co-benefits, particularly on the opportunity side, is something that we're looking at, very closely. And I think this is where this, access to the data, to the best available, is absolutely critical.
Good point to emphasize, because we are thinking more broadly than just the risks, the negative financial impacts, but also the opportunity space. James.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I think Ed actually pretty much covered my question. So thanks, Ed. But there is, in some ways, an elephant in the room whereby there's a disconnect between the impacts and dependencies for a company and the risks and opportunities for the financial institution, in that your sort of financial timelines are pretty short. An anecdote from an unnamed financial institution I had a one-on-one with said, look, if the blue-sided tree frog is extinct in 10 years, well, that's tragic, but I get paid in 5. So how do we, open question to anyone in the room, how do we solve that disconnect between the companies and financial institutions? Thanks.
I think I've had the privilege of being involved in a number of these sessions this week. So there's definitely some themes that have been coming out. And I think on Monday morning when we had the financial institutions focused, or one of them, there was certainly discussion about divestment based on a divestment strategy based on how your portfolio, I guess, were performing. And if some of them weren't performing up to scratch, you know, then there was certainly a risk management approach from the bank's perspective was to get them off your books. On TNFD related metrics or associated frameworks, let's talk broadly about that. Biodiversity and other performance, but yes, as one factor. And I guess, no, I'm not trying to thought. And so I think more and more what we're going to see, and I think this played out in the agribusiness discussion, whatever day that was that yesterday, that consumer expectations will start to, and stakeholder expectations will start to play a factor here. And in conversations with some of the big carbon project providers, and I know there was just a comment recently just online there about biodiversity co-benefits, and I think we're starting to evolve into a world where biodiversity is not seen as a co-benefit, but it's seen as a separate tradable entity in itself, that some businesses will be actually looking to trade in biodiversity credits, if you like, similar to how they trade in carbon credits, and valuing that from the perspective that consumers and stakeholders will require those things. So while the financial a business may only be paid in 5 years, there's stakeholder expectations will play out in a much longer time frame.
Maybe I'll also add just to note that there are valuation techniques like the natural capital protocol, for example, where you can start to put a value on some of these natural assets and look at present value, what the costs would be to replace or the implications would be. So, I mean, that's perhaps one way to sort of answer that question is can we translate, you know, the loss of a species into a particular cost to society, cost, and that becomes the sort of currency or the argument for why, you know, it should be taken into consideration in terms of somebody's executive compensation package or something like that. Go ahead, Ed. You had a comment on this. And I think after that, we're going to break out into groups. So
I did. I'm not sure if I'm going to add clarity or further muddy the waters, but I think it's really important to try and bridge this gap, especially when we're thinking about opportunities and we're seeing a big nature, and there's a big sort of discussion. There's a lot of talk about nature positive. What does it mean to be nature positive? There's a variety of definitions. IUCN has done a lot of work on this. The way that I simplify this in my head is there needs to be more nature tomorrow than there is today. But this takes time. Creating nature takes time. It's not something that we can just, you know, set aside an area of land and say, right, that's nature, good, we can value this can be included into a financial risk assessment. Restoration activities take a while to get going. It requires continuous investment. It requires continuous on the ground management. The extractive sector that we're talking to, they have vast experience of restoring degraded sites. They manage huge amounts of non-operational land that they can manage for nature, to start to help us help us as a global community move towards nature positive. I think one of the gaps we really need to bridge is how do we encourage the financial sector to allow them the time to realize those opportunities? How do we start to provide, you know, the leeway to say, well, again, our financial timeline, we need to report at the end of this year. We're not necessarily going to be able to regenerate nature by the end of this year, but it does need that continuous investment. It needs that relationship between the people that are on the ground undertaking this restoration work and the financial community to realize and appreciate the efforts that they're taking, that they are then potentially going to capitalize, trade on value. And so this is a really important conversation that needs to be had.
Okay, thanks, Ed. So I think we've touched on some really interesting themes and topics in the conversation, and I thank the panelists for providing their input and background from their experience and to describe some of the solutions that they're bringing to the forefront.